Good evening. On behalf of the Old North Foundation, welcome to the 250th is coming, a discussion of how Massachusetts should celebrate America's 250th birthday. Thank you for joining us in the beginning of a discussion that we hope will grow as we get nearer to 2026, which is just around the corner. I'd like to thank our distinguished panel of scholars and civic leaders who will help shape our conversation tonight. William Fowler from Northeastern, Martha McNamara from Wellesley College, Robert Allison from Suffolk University, Greg Gaylor from the Boston Preservation Alliance, and State Representative Byron Rushing. Each panelist will give a short overview of a topic related to celebrating the 250th, followed by a discussion with question and answer moderated by Bill Fowler. After that is over, or when our eyes are glazing over, you are all invited to join us next door to continue the conversation at a reception in our parish house. And that is just the first door to the left. There are restrooms over in that building. The large room will have some cheese and veggies, and the bar is actually in a smaller room on the other side by the kitchen. So there's enough room for all of us to gather over there. So please join us after the formal program for the informal program. And please, as we start this conversation tonight, remember that we need lots more people to be thinking about and talking about the important milestone of the 250th, so that we can do well by our nation and our commonwealth and our cities to make it not only a grand celebration, but a way to renew our commitment to the values that we all hold so dear as Americans. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Steve. I'm Bill Fowler, as Steve indicated. To my right is Greg Gaylor. To my left, Bob Allison, McNamara, and Byron Rushing. My task is to be brief. I guess as Elizabeth Taylor used to say to her husbands, I won't keep you long. But let us begin. And I think in any gathering here in Boston or in our Commonwealth, when you talk about the American Revolution, we should always begin with John Adams. So I'd like to read you a quote from John Adams that might get us started a bit. Adams said, "What do you mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and a consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was spilled at Lexington." I think that's certainly important for us to remember here in Boston and Massachusetts, where in truth, subsequent to the events, the historic events here at the beginning of the Revolution, a good deal of the war migrates to other parts of the country. But it is in Boston where it all began. Our first celebration, commemoration of the Revolution, the first important one, came in 1825, when the Marquis de Lafayette, in that kind of rock star final tour, came here to Boston and laid the cornerstone for the Buckingham Monument. Following that, for the Centennial, we kind of lost out. In the Centennial, there was a National Fair celebration in Philadelphia, and so Boston played very little role in the Centennial celebration. And then, of course, came the Bicentennial, which originally was intended to be a grand World's Fair, but they could never decide whether it should be Boston or Philadelphia. So after years of deadlock, they finally disbanded that idea and created the American Revolution Bicentennial Commission, which indeed spread out the celebration of the American Revolution throughout the country. I know that there are some people in this audience who actually lived through those years, as I did, and had personal memories. It seems to me, as I recall, it actually worked pretty well. Here in Boston and Massachusetts, we undertook our own celebration, working under the aegis of the National Bicentennial Celebration. They had a significant appropriation from Congress, by the way. We created here in Massachusetts our own Bicentennial Commission under Governor Michael Dukakis. Among the members, I might remind you, of that commission, indeed, is my colleague, over here, Byron Rushing, who proudly served on that commission in 1975, 1976. The purpose of that commission was not so much to organize state affairs as it was to encourage and support in a number of ways local activities in the 351 cities and towns of the Commonwealth. In Boston, they took a particularly important role. The mayor, then Mayor Kevin White, appointed a mayoral committee headed by Kathy Kane. That committee then created a nonprofit organization called Boston 200. And it was Boston 200 that actually undertook and directed, guided the various commemorations, various activities that took place here in the city. It was an extraordinarily ambitious agenda. In preparing for this evening, I was looking at their calendar and their manual. It's more than 100 programs they suggested. More than 100 programs, activities, lectures, exhibits were proposed. To be sure, not all of them took place, but the simple planning alone, I think, was really very, very impressive. That impressive organization left certain effects, certain things that we have lingered to today and still treasure. The question always is, what of these things, what was the lasting effect? Well, there were some lasting effects that I'd like to share with you and perhaps remind you of. Not the least of them was the Boston National Historical Park. That park was created just prior to the Bicentennial here in Boston and would not have been created had it not been for the press from Boston and other places to assist this community, which in the early 70s was in some difficulty when it came to preserving our historic treasures, to find assistance from the Park Service. It was a wonderful day in this community when the Boston National Historical Park came in. And then there was something else, too, that we see every day. Maybe not a direct result of the Bicentennial, but certainly assisted by it, and that was Quincy Market. Quincy Market was restored during the years of the Bicentennial and was in fact opened in August of 1976. And I doubt that that would have happened as well, had it not been for the enthusiasm and spirit, vitality that was being generated here in this community. This bicentennial effort also produced, and I brought it with me, and it may be familiar to some of you, this little book, which Martha and I were talking about a few minutes ago, which we as historians still use today. It is, I would suggest, although a bit out of date to be sure, the most comprehensive, intelligent guide to our city. It's got some wonderful essays in it written by Cleveland Amory and Al Lupo. And this was truly an important contribution. There were other things that happened as well. There were exhibits at the Museum of Fine Arts, exhibits at the Boston Museum of Science. There were a number of things that happened during those years that we should celebrate and remember. And it did produce some important results. And I hope that the similar things can happen as we now approach our 250th. But let me just conclude by making some observations. Not necessarily conclusions, but observations. Why did the bicentennial succeed? Or in as much as it did succeed, why did it succeed? I'd like to suggest to you, and suggest to the panel, perhaps we might want to talk about this, is first, it was broad-based. The centennial commissions of the towns and cities and the Commonwealth and the national one did as much as they could to reach as broad a base of Americans and Bostonians as possible. It would also have strong political support. The executive director of the National Bicentennial Commission was John Warner, later senator from Virginia, and among the commission members was Senator Edward Brooke from Massachusetts. So it was a commission with notable people, powerful people, committed people. Another element was corporate sponsorship. I mentioned to you this long list of programs that Boston 200 produced. Along with that list of programs, they offered sponsorships, and Boston corporations, in many instances, did sponsor various events. John Hancock, Insurance Company, for example, Hood, Milk Company, Gillette, Strideway, all stepped forward to support certain kinds of exhibits and programs, as did many nonprofits as well, in lecture series. And lastly, I would suggest that the Bicentennial had an interesting and important mixture of celebration and celebration. There was both the reenactments, which we all enjoy, and the parades, etc., which are always so much fun. But coupled with those were moments of celebration, when people gathered together to reflect in serious ways about what the American Revolution meant to America. And that combination left in lasting legacy. Well, I'll stop here, and because I'm sure you want to hear from the panel, and we have no particular order and no particular agenda. When the panel members have finished, we'll certainly open it up to the audience for your comments and questions and suggestions as well. So why don't I begin then with Greg?
I guess I picked the right seat. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. That was actually a good intro because some of the things you mentioned, I mentioned specifically, and we didn't even plan that. So I actually remember the Bicentennial very well. I was a 9-year-old kid, and I remember vividly the wildly elaborate red, white, and blue crosswalk they painted in front of my school, and the parades and their clouds of smoke from the musket salutes. And I even remember coming to Faneuil Hall for the ribbon cutting, and particularly remember the cake by Montilius shaped just like Faneuil Hall. And I've mentioned this many times because the Bicentennial actually truly impacted me. I don't think I'd be here as director of the Boston Preservation Alliance with about 30 years of preservation and history experience if it hadn't been for those seeds that were planted during the Bicentennial. And to me, this just demonstrates that historic preservation and museum work and historic sites have true meaning to people. They really create an impact. And I think as we prepare for the 250th, we have a lot to celebrate in Boston. And I think we have an opportunity to impact people like I was impacted. Not too many, but I guess more than I'd like to admit, years ago. Here in Boston, we inherit a rich history. We have an iconic built environment, and it's been stewarded well over the generations since the Bicentennial, but maybe not as well as we'd like. I think we all know we're in the midst of unprecedented economic and cultural growth here in Boston. People are selling their homes in the suburbs and moving back. We have businesses growing. We have a lot of visitors. Last year, in 2014, more than 16 million visitors coming to Boston for at least an overnight. So one question I ponder a lot is what's bringing these people here and re-energizing the continued growth of Boston? Certainly, people are leaving 128, more businesses are coming, and it's, there's certainly the activity, the cultural life, the social life, the convenience of not having to commute. But people can get that from any city, and I think here in Boston, an essential reason people are coming is for the character of the city. The unique character is unmatched compared to most cities. The sense of place that we get in the different neighborhoods here in Boston, that mixture of old and new. That ability to balance the historic resources and also the fact that we're a global hub of innovation. And you may have seen the article, it was in the Globe, or the Herald, I think it was in the Globe today, about the fact that we should be celebrating more of the technological innovation, which is true, but it's those in conjunction with the long history here in Boston of technology and political and social innovation. So I think that unique blend is really something that brings people to Boston and attracts them here. It really is a magnetic force that attracts across the generations. We certainly see lots of school groups here, millennials are coming and loving the old buildings and the warehouse buildings, but also the empty nesters coming back, and also international tourists. So I think as we celebrate our success, it's important to consider these places that have really become iconic and put Boston on the map. So iconic Freedom Trail sites like the Paul Revere House around the corner, the old State House, the Constitution, and of course right here, they're really powerful physical reminders that people can't get from other places. Things you can't learn from textbooks, that emotional connection. And I think being in a space like this, and maybe you feel it when you walk into a place like this, that connection not just to the political figures that made important actions back in the revolutionary period and then forward, but the everyday people like you and me who came here, pray on Sunday, and this was just a place to be. And I think that I find these places have real power. I mean, this is the place. This isn't just the place where you read about the text, but this is the place where those lanterns were held that we all read about. And it's funny, my daughter is a freshman out of state, out of Minnesota, and she was just back this weekend, and she wanted to come back to her city. So we wandered around Boston. She was talking about her history class and saying, oh, how many of you have been to these places? And she said, you forget being from Boston, that we walk by where the Boston Massacre occurred all the time. We come to this place all the time. These are powerful, strong places, and I think sometimes it's easy to forget that continuum of past, present, and future that we feel in these places. And we're here daily, and I think many of us who work in the city, or we're local enough to come often, and I think it leads to this sort of a bit of a delusion, because the places look so good when we look. We think everything's under control. in that all is good in the preservation world in Boston. We've got these great sites and people come. And I think we forget that preservation is an active process. It's easy over time to think that since these buildings and these places become such fundamental parts of the city that we take them for granted. And I think there are an awful lot of people who think, well, they're old, and you leave them alone, and they come down to next generations. And that's why we have them, because people didn't fuss with them, people just left them alone. But nothing could be further from the truth. These buildings are living, breathing organisms. They're affected by the environment, they're inherently deteriorating by the materials they have. And if left alone, they'll deteriorate and they'll be gone. We won't have them for future generations. Mortar deteriorates, fasteners on slate roofs typically last about 100 years. Paint, which seems very plebeian and something just for looks, actually protects wood from rot and from our lovely New England winters. Fire protection systems and heating systems need upgrading and care. And intervention through care and support is really a necessary thing if we want these buildings to survive, if we want people to be impacted by them like we've been. And I think it's also important to remember that what you see around you today in this building and around the city in general and any historic site is really an accumulation of change. That while authenticity is important, and Boston is full of authentic historic sites, it's really not true that the places you see today come to us unaltered. It's a common fallacy to believe that what you see today is exactly as it was historically. And that's okay, that's the work we at the Alliance do, and we work with other regulatory agencies like the Landmarks Commission and the Mass Historic Commission and the National Park Service to really figure out what are those character-defining features that are important to preserve and to keep looking what they did, and what can we change to modernize, to keep those buildings surviving and functional. And all the Freedom Trail sites have been altered one way or another. I mean, even here at Old North, I don't think Paul Revere would recognize the inside painted all white. And if you've seen pictures of Paul Revere's house around 1900, you probably wouldn't recognize it, he certainly wouldn't either. The old State House has been making a number of changes to return it closer to its historical use, and also trying to manage things like moisture and other challenges to keep these buildings alive. The list goes on and on. So historic preservation is an active process, and funding is a major issue. And thank goodness the sites themselves, like here and the Paul Revere House, have independently raised millions of dollars over the years to do much of the great work that they've done. But that's just not enough. Specifically, a couple of examples. There's a big backlog. Here at Old North Church, my understanding is there's an estimated $8 million in deferred maintenance to hit before the 250th. The Paul Revere House is looking at maybe $1 million or so over the next 10 years, and that's just 2 sites. There's another fallacy I just wanted to mention that I think leads to some challenges, and that brings us back to the Park Service, which is an important part here in Boston and a major player. We have a new superintendent, Michael Creasy. I don't know if Michael's here tonight. Is he hiding in the back? Hey, Michael. Michael's come on board and is an essential partner. He's brought his new urban agenda here to Boston, which we hope will rejuvenate and re-energize things. But there are far too many people who think the Freedom Trail sites are owned, managed, and cared for entirely by the Park Service. And that's simply not true, and I think has led to some of the fundraising challenges, because people just think the feds will take care of it. And that's not the case. The park that was mentioned, the Boston National Historical Park, is 43 acres, but it's many layers of federal, private, and municipal ownership, very complex interrelationships, and to be honest, some of those relationships could probably use a little polishing and enhancing of their own. I'm sure Michael will help us with that. But we hope that upcoming 250th really provides an opportunity to jumpstart some of this work. And the Park Service only owns a teeny tiny piece, 15 State Street, Dorchester Heights, parts of the Charlestown Navy Yard, Bunker Hill Monument, and that's it. That's all the Park Service owns. And thankfully, through a variety of grants and other fundraising through the feds, the Park Service has been a huge part of keeping these sites along, and hopefully we can get more, but that's not the only solution. They're an essential element of the puzzle, but just one. And the Park Service itself has its own challenges. They face a huge backlog, over $11 billion overall, over $4 billion in historic resources, and that's as the Park Service is hitting its 100th anniversary. So personally, I find it pretty frustrating when I hear some of the rhetoric in Congress. You know, we hear of our great importance of our national history, how proud we should be of our founding fathers, or funding fathers, as some people like to say. And how we need to return to our core national values, but those same people refuse to provide the resources we need to protect these resources and to keep them alive, and to continue teaching those important lessons. And if, on the other hand, instead of waiting for these disasters to occur, which is what typically how it happens, we let small challenges in preservation grow. We think what's the problem? It's just another year, and the costs grow, and we wait till some major challenge like the wall's about to fall down, and suddenly then we have to fix it. If instead we get ahead of the curve and fix these challenges and maintain these sites, not only will they be here, but they'll teach important lessons to the tourists and our students about stewardship and about preservation as an active process and the importance of our national heritage. So I just wanted to conclude by pointing out a few things about, what do we do next? I mean, every day we wait is another day that it's costing more. And now I think the 250th is really the opportunity for some thoughtful planning with the Park Service, with the other sites, to bring these things together. The Alliance, we frequently talk about protecting places, promoting vibrancy, and preserving character, finding that sweet spot between keeping things the same and allowing change, to keep the sites better and to allow new development. And I think the 250th is a great opportunity to celebrate Boston and how we do that, how we talk about past, present, and future. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine Boston without places like the Paul Revere House or here at Old North, and what those lessons teach. But if we continue to ignore the sites, we're going to have problems doing that. We have to figure out how these sites remain relevant to our time, connected with the past, and continue to provide people learning opportunities like I found back in Bicentennial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Bob?
Inevitably, when I think about the history of Boston and the history of the Revolution, I think about Mary Ann, a young girl who had immigrated to Boston from Tsarist Russia. She was in second grade in the schools at this point in Chelsea in February, I think, of 1893, and she didn't think that her classmates fully appreciated the gift they had been given by the founding generation. So she took it upon herself to write a poem celebrating George Washington. And you would think, what would Washington be to an 8-year-old Jewish girl from Russia, and what would she be to Washington? But it turns out they had quite a lot to say to each other. And I think that is a point we miss here in Boston when we talk about our history, the history how it will impact the lives of the 8-year-olds in the Boston public schools today. What connection do they have with a building like this, or with the Paul Revere House, or with the USS Constitution? But we know that unless they come to love this history, all of these places will disappear. They will go the way of the Hancock House, the Green Dragon Tavern, William Lloyd Garrison's print shop, and other places that once were. As Greg indicated, we look at these places and take them for granted and assume they have always been here, and so they always will be. But those who are entrusted with the care of them know how tenuous our hold on the past is. And our hold is only as strong as the commitment we have to maintain them. And that's a commitment that really begins in the schools of Boston, where we do a terrible job teaching history. Not because students don't know how to answer questions on a multiple choice test, but because they don't emerge from the schools loving the history that happened here and feeling they are a part of this history, and this history speaks to them. Within the next 10 years, half of all the students in the Boston public schools will grow up speaking a language other than English. Just as Mary Ann came from a different place, the students in Boston today are coming from different places. And like Mary Ann, it's our responsibility to teach them this history and how it is important to their lives. As Mary Ann understood, the story of Washington was crucial to her life as a young girl fleeing the oppression of Tsarist Russia. So the stories of Paul Revere and Prince Paul and the other heroes and heroines and villains of the Revolution are part of this eternal story, this emerging story. It's really essential. And it's partly up to those of us here who are historians, but it's really up to everyone here who loves history to share it. And one goal we should have as we're thinking about best ways to commemorate or celebrate the 250th is how can we ensure that every child going to school in Boston visits Dorchester Heights, and Old North Church, and Fort Hill and the Dillaway Thomas House in Roxbury, the pieces of history that are woven into the fabric of the city in every neighborhood. And it's really up to us. Those of us who are gathered here tonight are here because we are committed to preserving history and to telling stories. And it's up to each of us to leave this place as evangelists so that we will continue sharing the story and bring others into it. It's essential. And if we lose this opportunity for the 250th anniversaries of the Revolution to tell the story, there will be little reason to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the Revolution, which will happen after our poor tongues have ceased their wagging. That's all I have to say this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Martha, please.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about some activities that have already begun to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. I'm going to talk specifically about a group called the Revolution 250 Forum, which is a consortium of historic sites, nonprofit organizations, cultural tour groups, and government agencies in Boston that have come together to promote public history programs related to the 250th. Now, as others have said, between 2015 and 2026, Boston has the opportunity to commemorate the anniversaries of events that ultimately led to the Revolution. From the first protests at the Liberty Tree during the summer of 1765, to the reading of the Declaration of Independence from the balcony of the old State House in July of 1776. In that roughly 10-year period, Bostonians argued over and hammered out ideas about liberty and self-governance. We now know, even if they didn't realize it at the time, that these arguments and public demonstrations would ultimately lead to revolution and the founding of the United States. What we have here then in the next 10 years is a rare opportunity to put Boston at the center of the Revolution's 250th anniversary and to highlight the importance of ordinary people acting to bring about change. It's an opportunity to move beyond the outdated view of the Revolution as the work of a handful of elite politicians to a more inclusive, nuanced, and ultimately a more compelling story, one that puts ordinary Bostonians at the center of the action. In fact, as others have said, the story of how the Revolution began is Boston's story. The first actions of protest took place here, and the debates about liberty and self-governance were argued both in our streets and in the Representatives' Chamber of the old State House. The Revolution 250 Forum wants to be sure that Boston is at the forefront of commemorating these anniversaries, and that we do so in a way that both tells the story and makes those events relevant for today's Bostonians, no matter what their background. And as Bob has said, with so many Bostonians coming from places outside of the United States, this seems more of a challenge, but even more important. The Revolution 250 Forum's debut event took place on Friday, August 14th, and I know that many of you were there. That evening, we celebrated the very first event of the American Revolution, the gathering of Bostonians under the Liberty Tree to protest the Stamp Act. Now, the Liberty Tree stood at the corner of Washington and Essex Street in Boston in what is now the Chinatown neighborhood, and you may know the site as the location of the former location of the Registry of Motor Vehicles. On that site, we hosted a public art event celebrating the actions of the hundreds of ordinary people who came together that very night, 250 years ago, to protest for political change. Drawing on the 18th century tradition of illuminating the Liberty Tree, we commissioned the production of 108 copper lanterns that were then decorated by 5 different Boston community organizations. And I brought one of our lanterns with us. You can come up and take a look at it after the panel. Each of the 5 community groups participated in workshops that explored the history of the Stamp Act protests and highlighted the concept of liberty. Participants then decorated the lanterns with images and text in response to the question, what does liberty mean to me? On the night of August 14th, community group participants carried these copper lanterns from different historic sites around the city to converge on Liberty Tree Plaza for a gathering of commemoration. Once there, digital images and quotes about liberty, both historic and contemporary, were projected on buildings lining the plaza. Public historians, community groups, tourists, and passers-by all took a moment on a beautiful August night to contemplate the power of that collective action 250 years ago. For me and for others, this event fulfilled the promise of good public history. It gave historic resonance to our understandings of liberty. It underscored the importance of constructive civic dialogue to contemporary American society. And it engaged a wide swath of Bostonians for whom Revolutionary era history had not seemed that important or that relevant to their own lives. I think we made powerful connections between the experiences of 18th and 21st century Bostonians. Now, that Liberty Tree celebration was a fantastic start, and it set a high standard for subsequent commemorations. But we are faced with a long run up to the anniversary of the Declaration in 2026. And while some years have particularly memorable anniversaries, for instance, 2020 will be the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, 2023 will be the Tea Party, and of course 2026, the Declaration of Independence. And evacuation. I had that here. The years in between can quickly become a blur of forgettable details. Do you remember the Declaratory Act? How about the Townsend Acts, the Quebec Act? Basically, for Bostonians, it was one damn thing after another. And our difficulty, our challenge, is how do we keep our audience engaged in the revolution's narrative without losing momentum or overwhelming them with details. Now, Nat Shidley, the historian at the Bostonian Society, has been fantastic at helping us to shape our public programs. And he has proposed a format for thinking about this 10-year arc as 3 different chapters. The first chapter would be the Stamp Act crisis and its aftermath. So basically the years 1765 to 1766. The second chapter is the occupation of Boston, culminating in the Boston Massacre, so the years 1768 to 1770. And the third chapter would be the prelude to independence, stretching from the destruction of tea and the so-called Tea Party to independence, so 1773 to 76. Now with this format, we hope to be able to commemorate signal events of the Revolution in a way that's accessible, intelligible for the public, and sustainable for the city's public history organizations. So we've begun chapter 1, the Stamp Act crisis, with a commemoration of Liberty Tree, and we hope to finish off this chapter by marking the repeal of the Stamp Act next May. The English Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March of 1766, but Boston, of course, didn't get the news of the repeal until May 15th, and they celebrated the repeal lavishly on May 19th, 1766. And I love the descriptions of the celebration of the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. They roasted an ox on Boston Common. John Hancock opened up a pipe of Madeira for the citizens of Boston, and a pipe of Madeira, I looked it up, is 112 gallons of Madeira. And the Liberty Tree was illuminated with 108 lanterns, symbolizing the margin of victory of the votes in Parliament for repeal. And I should say these lanterns that we had commissioned for the August event are actually replicas of an original lantern that hung on the Liberty Tree that's in 1765, that's now in the collections of the Bostonian Society. Okay, so back to the celebration. While the ox and the Madeira seem a little bit out of our reach, other aspects of the celebration, public gatherings and illumination, seem fitting. We'll be working out the details in the months to come and invite anyone who is interested in this project to join us with your good ideas and your willingness to work on it. Now, one last thing I want to say in conclusion, and that is that a long-lasting benefit of these commemorations that we've begun, and we hope there'll be others, of course, but one important benefit, it seems to me, has been the fostering of a real spirit of collaboration among a diverse group of public historians across the city, from the sites on the Freedom Trail to commercial tour group operators to government agencies. And for me, to continue that kind of collaboration, to be able to make the revolutionary past relevant, engaging, and thought-provoking across the city for visitors and residents alike is one of the key goals that we should be aiming for as we commemorate Boston's pivotal role in the American Revolution.
Thank you, Martha. Bob, please.
When we lose our memory, we lose the ability to know both where and when we are. Our orientation is made possible, defined by memory. When we have no memory, we become disoriented. When I try to explain the importance of history to young people, I ask them to engage in an exercise, a role play of losing their memory. They quickly understand that they are not able to answer questions like, what day is this? Or what room or building are they in? I then tell them that I have not lost my memory, and they begin to ask me those questions. And I answer with inaccuracies, with lies. And they realize that theirs is not only a disorientation of time and place, it is also a disorientation of recognizing truth and falsehood. This is the dangerousness of amnesia. Now, we're in Old North Church, so I will try to give a fancy word for the opposite of amnesia. Theologians have that word, and they call it anamnesis. History is our corporate memory. It is the memory of our individual existence incorporated into the memories of others' existence. If it is not known, forgotten, lost, stolen, or strayed, we suffer from corporate amnesia. Today, when we consider what we should be commemorating, celebrating, remembering, we have an opportunity to recall. We have an opportunity to recall these incredible events of 250 years ago, but we also can recollect why we know so little about them. We need to recollect why we know so little about most of the people who were here. We have an opportunity to cure our amnesia and consider the opportunities of corporate amnesis. The stories which we combine into the set of experiences, beliefs, and values that affect the way we as Americans perceive who we are, is sometimes called a paradigm. The values or system of thought in a society that are most standard and widely held at a given time. Dominant paradigms are shaped by both the community's cultural background and by the context of the historical moment. A more accurate history will lead us to a new paradigm, what is called a paradigm shift. If we accurately consider what occurred, be prepared for a paradigm shift. So my first suggestion for what we try to do with this commemoration is something we have not been very good at in all the former commemorations. Now, we did pretty well in 1976, but if you want to talk about horrible commemorations, think about commemorating the Civil War. And so if we are going to speak to a commemoration that is going to have an effect on how we view our lives, I I think it is essential that we begin with what story we tell. There are many paradigms that I could use, but I want to suggest that the paradigm should be around founding. And who founded America? Who founded Massachusetts? Who founded Boston? And on one hand, we know, or certainly the people at this table know, that it wasn't only white men. Right? And we know enough to mention other people. But if you asked us, what did those other people do? It gets very, very shallow. So I suggest that we begin with an understanding of the founders that includes everybody. It includes the Aboriginal people who met the Europeans and then met the Africans. It includes those three groups of people. It includes the Aboriginal people who were in Massachusetts at any time that we want to commemorate. It includes the Africans who were in Massachusetts since at least 1638. And of course, it includes the Europeans, most of whom were English. So what we in our language have come to call the red, the white, and the black. And they must be in this new paradigm if the paradigm is to approach the truth, which I think is the essential value in our commemoration. It is the truth. Now, this revised paradigm of our founding will still contain our civic scripture, like when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bounds. It will include we, the people of the United States, because I don't think we can do this commemoration and just end at the Declaration of Independence or end at the Treaty of Paris. It all was done and had results, and we cannot not talk about the results. However, this new paradigm will always have space to ask, who is the our? Who is the we? And if the our and the we include the fictional our and we that most history delves into, then we will have gotten nowhere. I suggest that we use this as an opportunity to expand the paradigm, to make the paradigm more truthful. Now, the civic scripture is pretty impressive. We don't have to diss the civic scripture in order to include other words. When Adam Hochschild in Bury the Chains points out that at the end of the 18th century, what we're talking about, the time we're talking about, well over 3/4 of the people in the world were in bondage. So the words that we hear in the Declaration of Independence and in the preamble are no doubt revolutionary in that world setting. So no one can doubt the revolutionary nature of these propositions. In 2008, the then Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, gave a remarkable interview, probably the only interview where she talked about race. And she reflected, well, you know, America doesn't have an easy time dealing with race. I sit in my office, and the portrait immediately over my shoulder is Thomas Jefferson, because he was my first predecessor. He was the first Secretary of State. Sometimes I think to myself, what would he think, a black woman Secretary of State as his predecessor 65 times removed? What would he think that the last two successors have been black Americans? And so obviously when this country, she goes on, when this country was founded, the words that were enshrined in all of our great documents and that have been such an inspiration to people around the world, they didn't have meaning to an overwhelming element of our founding population. This country was born with a particular birth defect that makes it hard for us to confront it. I suggest that be part of our agenda, confronting and naming the birth defect in this commemoration and this anniversary. So, can we use these proposed commemorations to create a new paradigm? This new paradigm will acknowledge all who own those words by their hearing, heeding, and incorporation of them into their lives over the protests of the very people who wrote them, over the protests of those who continue today to believe these words as narrowly as Jefferson and Washington did. And this new paradigm will find and publish and raise up the words of the indigenous and the Africans to meet the words of the English and other Europeans. This new paradigm is necessary to abolish the artificial concept of race, a construct invented in the 15th and 16th centuries and refined in the 17th, 18th, and 19th in order to make slavery more efficient by confining, reserving it to Africans and people of African descent, and preserved to the present in order to preserve their descendants in profitable states of discrimination and what we call racism. This new paradigm will not fear the bad news. I suspect the main reason why it is so difficult to approach truth is because of the bad news. And deny it is our heritage whenever we or our parents arrived on these shores. Maya Angelou is correct. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, and if faced with courage, need not be lived again. To this recalling, this facing with courage, we must raise up the idealism and success and victory as well as the horror. So, I have a proposal, a suggestion. Gary Nash believes the War of Independence was the cover for the largest rebellion of Africans in American history. The means of that rebellion was escape, running away. And more African Americans ran away in those years than ever before or after. On the other hand, also during those years, more Africans fought with the British, for the British, than with the Americans, for the Americans. These are all pieces of a history we have to tell. And we have to find the examples of that history in Massachusetts and Boston to make this commemoration relevant for everybody in Massachusetts and Boston today. So let me suggest that we commit ourselves to writing and speaking in this whole commemoration a number of the words that we use in this whole commemoration should be commensurate with the demographics of the existing population at that time. 20% of the population of America at the time was African. Make sure that we have 20% of all words be about those Africans. I don't know exactly what the percentage of indigenous people were at that time in the part of America that would become the United States in the 1780s. But that also should suggest the amount of story that gets told that includes them, where they were, whose side they were on, what bored them to death. Tell the story of everyone who is there. Let the hearers of the story decide who they like and wish to identify with. We should not make that decision for them. We should tell the truth, and we historians should take our thumb off the scales.
Thank you very much, Byron. And thanks to all of the panel for some provocative, interesting, and clearly very important thoughts. Well, you've heard from us. We'd like to hear from you. In the audience, do you have comments, observations, suggestions? Please, it's a little difficult here for me to see you, so gentlemen over here, and please try to speak up. It's a beautiful, lovely church, but the acoustics are awful. Yes, please.
Hi. If I recall correctly, the Bicentennial 200 triggered a lot of research into events 200 years earlier and, new opinions. Do you think the 250th will do the same? New facts about what happened 250 years ago.
Let me simply repeat the question in case you didn't hear it. The question was, will the 200th anniversary of Bicentennial produced a lot of new information and research on our past? Will the 250th have a similar accomplishment?
Well, I think that's really up to everybody that's in this room. It's up to the forum that's been formed already, and it's up to how we describe what the task should be. And we will, if we tell the story of the revolution, a story about how as many people as we can identify what they did, how they lived during those years, it will be brand new. If we have to, right now, if you want to find out what happened to different people, you have to read different books. There is no one book that tells us what happened to everybody. So we still, we have historians writing today that calls people who didn't support the revolution by a nickname. We don't call them what they call themselves. They didn't call themselves Tories, right? They call themselves Royalists. We're still doing that. And so this is a story about a conflict, right, that most historians in this country have already chosen which side they're on. So you have to go read Canadians, or you have to go read somebody who decides to write a book about a specialized group of Africans who left the colonies after the revolution. So let's tell that whole story all together. And telling that whole story all together, a lot of people will learn a lot of new things, including a lot of historians.
I might also suggest that good research comes from curiosity and being uncomfortable with what you think you know. So I think as teachers, and I'm sure there are many teachers here, the most important thing in teaching history is to inspire curiosity in the students and to ask them to inquire whether or not something is true. So I think something like the 250th can, when properly done, invigorate the whole fundamental sense of curiosity and finding us going back to re-examine those things that we think we know so well and maybe we don't. Other questions, please. And again, I apologize for the light. Yes, sir, please.
A moment ago you mentioned about corporate sponsorship. We all know in order to get these messages and programs out, it's going to take money, both from sponsorships and on the media side too. I remember during the Bicentennial, one of the greatest things ever I learned as a kid. Every night on the media news, they had a program called 200 Years Ago Today. And these are where these facts come out. Where are you in the process right now of identifying corporate sponsorship packages, opportunities, but more importantly, media sponsorships?
Would anyone like to comment on that?
Well, we could use help. So the Revolution 250 Forum has been meeting for about a year and a half. And as I said, we've done a lot of work sort of building a collaborative model among the group that's around the table, and we focused particularly on this first event, commemorating the first event actually of the revolution, the protest of the Liberty Tree. And we made some attempts to find corporate sponsorship with not very much success. In fact, we were very lucky to have the Park Service step forward and give us some funding to commission the copper lanterns and run the workshops and things. I think part of the problem is that it still feels very abstract for people. That 2026 actually seems kind of like a long way away. And I also don't think that that there's been a lot of attention paid to the anniversaries leading up to the revolution, which from my point of view are really, that's Boston's opportunity. That's the opportunity that we have to tell Boston's story. So I guess what I would say is that we could use a lot of help with finding corporate and media sponsorship, and if you have ideas, we would love to talk with you about them.
Thank you, Martha. I think the gentleman in the back, please.
My question is regarding costume interpretation or methods of, I don't want to call it theatrical, but revolutionary history as it was presented. I don't think that anyone would argue that we're lucky enough to have historic sites like this church, like Walter House and others near us. And one of the main reasons people often come to these sites is in order to connect with history in the most visceral ways, to be able to be in the same places where these events happen and these people stood. But at the same time, we've been doubly blessed of late. We've had events like the RNA arriving recently. I think the Tea Party events are coming up soon, in which these events are kind of put back on and shown off as they were. These reenactments oftentimes seem to solve educational problems. I mean, it was mentioned, perhaps the population of Boston changing linguistically, but I have yet to see a field at Lexington Green where musket fire was shot that needed subtitles. And on that front, I'm curious, has any thought been put into specific historical reenactment or the connection of sites through reenactment for the 250 program?
Let's see. We have not thought specifically about reenactment for the Liberty Tree celebration in August. We hadn't thought about it. I mean, we had given some thought to it, but didn't have the resources to pull it together. One thing that we'd really like to do, one idea would be for the sort of second chapter that I talked about, the occupation of Boston, is to actually have an encampment on Boston Common of reenactors. I think that would really bring home to people what it was like to live in an occupied city in the 1770s. But I certainly agree with you that there are ways of telling the story that are not necessarily so stringently didactic. And what I mean by that is that you mentioned theatrical presentations. I think that's a great way to sort of capture people's imaginations. And I do know that the Bostonian Society is going to be hosting a history theater in the month of May of 2016, that relates to the Boston Massacre. It's called Blood on the Street. It's a purpose-written play that's going to be put on in the old State House in May. So I think that that'll be a great opportunity to be thinking about these theatrical productions. So I completely agree with you. A combination of reenactors, theater, these are all great ways to engage people with an understanding of history.
And if I can just add something too. One reason we're here, and Martha and I have both been involved in Rep 350, isn't so that we can present to you what our vision is of what this will be. So yes, we want corporate sponsorship. Yes, we want broad-based community. Yes, we want to tell all of these stories. But we really need a broader community. So one thing we were hoping would come out of this evening, and I thank Reverend Ayers for hosting this, is so that more of us will become energized and engaged in this story, so that in 10 years you won't have the five of us sitting here telling you now what we're going to do, because the revolution was, as Representative Rushing said, it's something that involved a lot of people on different sides. And so our real hope is that we will leave here all part of this commemoration.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, please.
So at the risk of being amongst historians and thinking about something other than history, let me root what I'm about to say in something very historical. Bill, you started with a quote from John Adams that referred to the 10 years, 1760, 1770, was the 15 years, up to between 1760 and Lexington, or 1776 if you prefer, as being experiments. I mean, we really didn't know. I think it was Joseph Ellis who said that in 1760, the notion of defeating the world's greatest military force was unlikely, and the thought of inventing democracy, a secular democracy, was unimaginable. So I'm wondering what it would be like to take the experience of the folks who lived there, all of the folks who lived there, and think about what it's like for those of us alive today. What are the unlikely, the improbable, the insurmountable challenges that we're facing today? What do we need to invent to address racism, to address the wealth and income divide, to address what's going on in Paris right now in terms of the threats to the planet? These are challenges for today. And I guess the question is, can we frame a series of conversations, events, etc., that don't only recreate and make alive for us today what happened then, but the spirit of that searching that we need to be doing today if we're to have a future.
Thank you very much. The vicar of Old North has kindly invited us to adjourn next door for a bit of libation. And so, if you'll allow me, I'd like to adjourn this part of our meeting and invite us to go next door and continue this very important conversation. Steve, would you?
Thank you. On behalf of everybody who's come tonight, we are delighted that you've been able to raise some questions to help us start thinking about celebrating the 250th, and I hope that all of us here tonight will, in one form or another, help in this work. It's a great vision to keep focused on for the next 10 years. A plug for Rev 250, they have a website and a Facebook page. It's very good to use to follow what events are coming up. Also, at the rear of the church, on your way over to the reception, some of our staff will have some survey forms to talk about tonight, and also at the bottom to solicit some of your ideas as to what we can do to celebrate the 250th. I think what we're looking for here is depth. In my research about the Bicentennial, you know, I would like to do more than have Elton John show up at the Gillette Stadium as the Statue of Liberty, which he did at the previous stadium in 1976. It's more, for me, this is an opportunity for more than a party. And while promotion of tourism is very important and important for corporate sponsors, the promotion of the values that we all find in the events leading up to the revolution and liberty, and the values that those who were not included the first time tried to find in those documents, so that they were values that we all share. That's so important, and I really hope that we can work with all of you on promoting those values as we approach this milestone. With that, please join us next door for a little bit of libation and more conversation. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you, Steve.